Soul Sparks with Saima. And tonight we are joined by our amazing guest, Tamika Stewart, executive coach, licensed therapist, and organizational strategist who blends heart and strategy to help leaders break free from patterns that hold them back. She is here to unpack three big challenges so many of us face: burnout, boundaries, and self sabotage, and how we can turn them into stepping stones for clarity, capacity, and courageous leadership. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Tamika. So, Tamika, burnout is everywhere in today's fast paced world. So, can you share some of the earliest signs someone is headed for burnout that they often miss?
Oh, that's such a great question because a lot of times people think that burnout is just about doing too much, but it really isn't. It's about doing too much without alignment. So, to your point, there are not just physical symptoms of burnout, which most people think about, just feeling tired and fatigued, but there are also emotional, mental, and spiritual signs of burnout that we need to look for. So, one of the things when it comes to emotional burnout is you may find yourself feeling irritable or maybe becoming impatient over really small things. Sometimes there's a sense of emotional numbness or just feeling flat. Even doing things that you maybe used to find enjoyable. Sometimes with signs of burnout, you may start feeling a level of resentment towards your responsibilities or even towards people. And then when we think about those mental signs of burnout, it can show up even as brain fog, or you may find yourself forgetting stuff more. Another huge sign that I see with clients who are having mental signs of burnout is that negative self talk and that self criticism, which is really important because unchecked, negative self talk and self criticism can ultimately lead to depression and anxiety. You may find yourself having difficulty making decisions. And oftentimes we also see my clients have a loss of creativity. So not necessarily feeling that level of passion. And I think spiritual signs of burnout can actually be sometimes the most unchecked because it's very quiet. But you may find that you're feeling this disconnection from your purpose or meaning. You may start feeling cynical. Or if you have some type of spiritual practice, be it, formal religion or other types of spiritual practice, you may start to feel like you're just going through the motions and you may start to disengage and just start to have this sense of hollowness or just emotional emptiness. So those are the things that we always have to really be mindful of, especially with high functioners, because high functioning burnout for leaders, for soulful entrepreneurs, for them, it's really just that person that hides behind achievement. So it makes it harder to see with the naked eye.
That's really powerful point, Tamika. And I think the way you describe those subtle signs makes it really much clearer because so many people, dismiss them as just part of being busy or stressed. And hearing you frame it this way helps people like recognize that burnout isn't just about hitting a breaking point. It's about those small signals our mind and body give us along the way.
Yeah, it definitely happens when your body says no after your mouth sometimes has said yes too many times.
Absolutely, yes. So once those signs show up, like what's the first step to course correct?
Well, one of the things to start thinking about is how you can be ambitious, right? But you can also be well rested. And you don't have to earn rest. Oftentimes, many people, particularly people who may be listening to this podcast, are high achievers. And it's important to know that the success that you want is not necessarily just out there waiting for you to work yourself to death. It's about how safe you're going to feel, like really showing up as yourself. So, one of the things that I always suggest with my clients is to start looking at how you're thinking, right? Really take a minute to explore your thoughts. And you can do that through writing down a thought record, to look at the things that are your automatic thoughts that you're saying, particularly that may be negative, and to look for meaningful ways to reframe them. And it's really helpful to do this with a coach because by doing it with a coach, you're able to really be intentional about your automatic responses to things that are happening in your life and start to think a little bit differently about the decisions that you're making. Another thing that we also work with my clients is helping them do things like set mini boundaries. A lot of people who are feeling burnt out don't always have boundaries. And we can work on trying to practice micro boundaries because you just can't go from saying yes to everything to no to everything. So we want to be really realistic about what that looks like. So having some micro boundaries is also helpful. We also encourage our clients to consider things like a body check-in, doing a full body scan. And again, if you want to try this on your own, you can Google a full body scan activity on YouTube and actually do a 15-minute or 10-minute body scan to help you see where your body is holding stress. So there's so many different ways we can engage people to really start thinking about how you can look at burnout differently instead of just saying, it's just, I have too much work. It's about how do we manage that emotional labor of sometimes holding everyone else together, but ignoring yourself. Because we live in a world now where we've got people, professionals who are maybe caregiving for a parent, an elderly parent, while they're still caring for their young children and still trying to manage their own relationships, their friendships, being a wife, a daughter, a mother, a employee. And it can definitely be challenging trying to juggle all of those things together and still feel like you're doing something meaningful.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I too feel that sometimes when people realize they're burning out, it can feel like they need to completely overhaul their life. But the way you explain it shows that small intentional actions can actually shift things in a big way. And that's such a helpful perspective, Tamika.
Yeah, we want to take small steps because, to your point, if we are already feeling burnt out and overwhelmed, the thought of having to, just redesign your entire life is going to get you stuck in procrastination, which is a form of self sabotage, right? So you have all these things, all these great intentions, but you can't do it because it's so overwhelming. So, what I try to do with my clients is think about what is that first next step that you can take? What does that look like when we imagine what you want next for yourself, when you want some relief from the challenges that you're experiencing with burnout? What's that first step that we can take? And together we're able to help people identify what is that first step. And you can think about that now. When if you're someone that's experiencing this, what is that first next step you can take? Maybe it's setting the alarm clock a half an hour or 15 minutes earlier so you can do some journal prompting. Or maybe it's looking for a mantra for yourself, finding something that really resonates with you in terms of that motivates you and makes you feel better about where you are in your life, creating that mantra and finding it and just typing it out and printing it out. And maybe typing it and taping it to your computer. Little things that we can do to kind of help us start to move into the direction we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's so eye-opening. And also catching it early really makes a difference between recovery and collapse. And I completely agree with you. Now, boundaries can feel really uncomfortable, honestly, especially for high achievers. So, can you share a simple way to start building boundaries without guilt?
That's a great question. And one of the ways you can do it is also think about what it is that you need to actually accomplish. Like, where are your pain points? When you're thinking about work or in your personal life, where are your pain points? Again, so that we don't want to overwhelm ourselves and say we're going to do all these different things, right? And then end up doing nothing because we're so frustrated. The first thing to think about is how do we reframe boundaries as care and not necessarily rejection, right? Boundaries are not things that are just like this hard and fast wall, but they're guidelines that really can protect your energy, your time, and your well being. So instead of saying to yourself, oh gosh, if I don't do this, I'm letting this person down. It goes back to those thoughts, those negative thoughts that we have, and reframing it to say, you know what? I'm creating space to show up as my best self. So the first piece is really reframing boundaries and your language and how you look at boundaries. The second thing is also think about your why. A lot of times guilt comes up when we focus only on what the other person loses, but instead we have to start thinking about what you, right, and they indirectly can gain when you honor your own needs. So, for example, saying no to extra work means that you're going to actually avoid burnout, which is going to make you more present and more effective in the long run. So sometimes we're saying no to that short sprint so we can be ready for the marathon. And then finally, I think another way that, short, quick things that we can do is really start to practice our language. Sometimes when we are struggling with boundaries, we over explain and we apologize. And especially for women, women are notorious for apologizing. So instead of saying, I'm so sorry, I feel terrible, but I just can't, we want to reframe that language and say something like, I'm not available for that right now. Is there someone else I can refer you to? Right? Thank you for your understanding. Really being short and kind can help minimize some of those guilt spirals that we tend to have.
Absolutely. That's such a refreshing way to look at it. And I think a lot of people out there, especially high achievers, really need to hear that boundaries don't have to equal right. And being said that, again, the way you explain that, it makes it feel lighter and more doable. And it really shows that how setting limits can actually support us instead of holding us back.
Definitely, because it's important to remember that boundaries honor both sides, right? Because if there's not going to be any boundaries, that resentment starts to build, and that's what damages relationships. It's not necessarily the boundary; it's that resentment that starts to build up. And remember, healthy people do respect healthy boundaries. So if someone pushes back hard, it's really a reflection of their discomfort, not necessarily your selfishness. So, again, it goes back to thinking about when guilt creeps in, remember, it's not your job to sacrifice yourself to keep others comfortable, right? Boundaries are passion and it's love really in action because it doesn't have to be harsh, right? We have boundaries with warmth so that our bodies, our nervous system, our heart feels aligned with kindness while we're still honoring our limits. And that's important as well.
Absolutely, yes. It reframes boundaries as acts of clarity and care, I would say, and not walls of rejection. And that's so liberating. Now, self sabotage is such a tricky one because it's often unconscious, right? So, how can someone begin to recognize when they're getting in their own way?
Oh, that's such a good point, question, because a lot of times people don't recognize it. And that can be, again, it shows up as saying, oh, well, I have to work. I don't know what else to do because there are so many behaviors that they've been practicing they think are normal. So a couple things to start thinking about is avoidance. Do you see any patterns of avoidance? Oh, I really want to apply for that promotion, but oh, I'll apply later, or I'm not ready yet. Now, I see this a lot with my entrepreneurial clients. A lot of times, my clients will come in, they are subject matter experts. I mean, they really are the best that ever did it in their field, but yet they still feel like they need another certification before they can get started. They still feel like they need to perfect their website before they can go live. They still feel like they need to, enhance their offering. And the reality is what they have is good enough to get started, but that avoidance to going live prevents them from finishing those projects and doing what they need to do. I mean, that is just a classic pattern of self sabotage that I typically see in my solopreneurs. Another thing is that procrastination and perfectionism, which is kind of piggybacks off of what I said earlier. You'll set these unrealistically high standards knowing that you're ultimately going to fail because it's totally unrealistic. So, you want an Apple worthy website. Like everyone's been to Apple's website. It's super dope. It has all the bells and whistles. And unless your website looks like that, which we already know that a new entrepreneur, a startup, a startup leader does not necessarily have the budget for that type of website. So they're automatically setting themselves up for failure because their standards are a little bit too high. Sometimes another thing is choosing short-term relief over long-term goals. So, those things are, well, I feel so overwhelmed. I'm just going to spend all my budget right now because I don't think I'm going to do any better anytime soon. So I'm just going to spend my budget. I'm going to get that new laptop. Even though I don't necessarily need it, saving really should be a priority. And it also shows up in your personal life. If you're overeating, over drinking, a lot of times I see clients binge scrolling. When I've asked clients to really take account of the amount of time that they spend binge scrolling. So we can try to find some hours in their day so that they can, engage in their projects, engage in their client, in their roles. We are losing so much time based on binge scrolling, which again is another form of sabotage. So those are some things that we think about, including sabotaging relationships. And also I just want to also highlight the fear of success. A lot of times we always focus on the fear of failure, but it's important to address the fear of success. So often sometimes we back out when opportunities arrive because we feel there's too much responsibility, or we downplay our talents by refusing leadership roles. So oftentimes people feel that not just fear of failure, but fear of success could bring rejection or unnecessarily pressure. So when we start recognizing those, and that's why I love having clients start to really be intentional and start building their awareness of the things that they're saying and thinking. When you start to recognize them, you have to ask yourself the question, okay, wait a minute. If I'm delaying something, if I'm excusing something, or if I'm just absolutely dismissing something, I have to ask yourself, is this protecting me or is this preventing me? Right? Those are two questions to ask yourself.
I love that how practical that is, Tamika. And sometimes self sabotage feels like this big, heavy concept, but the way you broke it down makes it easier to recognize in everyday life. And that kind of guidance makes change feel possible and not overwhelming.
For sure. If you're able, to keep a journal of your triggers, you can start to see patterns, right? Well, when is it do you start undermining yourself? When do you start to feel stressed or fear of judgment? Those things can help you see that self-sabotage usually shows up when there's a gap between what you say you want and what your actions support. So, that's someone who would say, "Oh, this always happens to me. I just have bad luck." Well, no, it could actually be a repeated self sabotage loop that we have to really make sure we're intentional about addressing.
Yes, that makes sense. I agree with that completely. So, have you seen a pattern of how self sabotage shows up in leaders you coach?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. I can think about one of my clients who was she was in her late 30s. Well, she is. She's in her late 30s. A nonprofit leader, very heart centered, deeply committed to her work. And on paper, wow, she was a powerhouse. She was in a PhD program. In fact, she was wrapping up a PhD program. She was leading a growing team, doing all these things. But by the time she started working with me, she was waking up with anxiety every morning. She was in her car crying before she came into work. She was saying yes to everything so she could be a team player, even though she didn't necessarily want to say yes to everything. So when it came to her self sabotage, it really looked like procrastination, but it wasn't. It was really fear. It was fear of what might happen if she actually slowed down and had to start feeling everything that she'd been suppressing. So as I mentioned, I'm also a licensed therapist. And with my high functioning coaching clients, also encourage them, if I'm coaching them, I also encourage them to get connected with a therapist, because sometimes some of those things that they don't want to feel, those things that may be suppressing, could be rooted in some trauma they've had that they need to work through with another licensed therapist. So I always encourage my clients, as we start to unpack and explore the why of some of the challenges they're having at work. Oftentimes there's some challenges of unresolved challenges that they've experienced, or unresolved trauma that they've experienced in their life, that they need to also work out with their therapist while they're also receiving coaching from me. So, once she was able to do that, we worked together on rebuilding her sense of internal safety, because there were some things that happened to her that made her not feel safe, and felt that the only way she could be seen by people was to be hyper successful. Again, we talked about naming that inner voice that, says you don't get to rest, which sometimes happens to a lot of professionals, people in their mid to mid 50s. They start to feel like we're in this culture where you just have to move. We have a hustle culture where you don't necessarily honor rest. In fact, I've heard, mantras like, "Oh, sleep is the cousin of death." Like they don't want to sleep. And that's totally, counterproductive and does not support a wellness practice or someone who is actually craving aligned growth, emotional healing, and inner freedom. So, once we were able to, work on some of those things, she wasn't just coping anymore. She started to create. In addition to her being a nonprofit leader, she also was a poet, and she wrote poetry. And she hadn't been writing for like over a year when we started to work together. She was working, 12-hour days, and she was finally able to scale back her work hours, still be successful at work, but not have that guilt, right? And that's really what we wanted to help her focus on. So it was really, really helpful because remember, no one's perfect. No one's going to be perfect. And if you're looking for perfection, I'm not your person because I'm not perfect. But
Yeah,
we can be empowered.
that's indeed empowered. And it really shows that even the most successful leaders can face these patterns, and acknowledging them isn't a weakness for sure. And it's actually part of what makes growth and stronger leadership possible. And I love how you highlighted that.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, right? Oftentimes we have to give ourselves permission to just explore a little bit more, explore ourselves a little bit more.
Absolutely, yes. Now you emphasize that leadership is both inner work and organizational work. So I really wonder that how do burnout, boundaries, and sabotage ripple out into team culture?
So you're right. They definitely shape organizational culture. And when we have leaders and staff that operate in burnout, constant overwork becomes an unspoken standard, right? People start to learn that being always on means being valued. I know when I was the vice president of a mid-sized, behavioral healthcare company in Philadelphia, people were it was normal culture to send emails 2, 3 o'clock in the morning after work. And this was early in my career, and I felt the pressure to make sure I responded because that was the messaging that I was getting from executive leadership. So we do need to be mindful of what that looks like, which is very different from when I started my business and I said to my team members, "Hey, look, occasionally I may send an email after hours. It is not meant for you to respond. It is just a time that I have set available to respond. Please do not respond to the next morning. If there's an emergency, I will, reach out to you." So we set a standard on, what is actually valued within an organization. When we think about ripple effects on organizational culture, we start to also see erosion of psychological safety, right? Because exhausted teams are not going to take risks. They're not going to speak up. They're going to be so afraid of dropping the ball, right? Let me dot my I's and cross my T's. Let me, CC the entire organization. The fear of doing all those things really overrides creativity. And then finally, you're going to end up seeing that high turnover and disengagement because burnout really spreads and staff will either leave or I had a colleague once say they retired in place, right? They'll disengage and that's going to fuel the cycle over and over again.
That's really a great point about being mindful. And I too feel that mindfulness really, is at the heart of sustainable leadership. And it's so important to recognize that how our inner work doesn't stop with us, it ripples out into we team function, communicate, and even handle challenges. And that's really a powerful reminder, right?
For sure. I mean, if you're a leader and you're modeling and setting respectful boundaries, you automatically give permission for staff to do the same. And that you can ripple positive effects like having stronger teams trust, where there's clarity around roles and responsibilities. You'll start to see that retention and loyalty. You'll see that people will feel like their lives are respected and they're going to be much more likely to invest in the mission and actually stay. So those are the things that we see when you are, having appropriate boundaries, you will see that creativity and problem solving start to flourish. So I mean, you really start to see that sustainability and that shared responsibility when you have healthy organizations and healthy leaderships that ripple out into the rest of the organization.
Absolutely, yes. That makes sense. I agree with that. In fact, yes. Now, for those listening who feel stuck right now, burned, or boundaryless, or sabotaging their own goals. So, what's one short practice they can start today to begin reclaiming clarity and energy?
The mini practice, the short practice that I would say right now is to start journaling, right? Start feeling your body and noticing where those pain points come up. Start analyzing your thoughts. When you find yourself saying something negative, ask yourself, where is this coming from? Like, if I'm not setting a boundary, why? What is this feeling? Remember earlier in the conversation, we talked about what is this preventing me from doing? What is this allowing me to do? So, really start to be more mindful of what you're saying. And if you need some help and support in that, start journaling. If you're not sure, if you're like, I'm just clueless, then starting a journaling practice where you start to explore some of your feelings. Those would be the first next step items I would suggest for one to do.
That's really a beautiful and practical suggestion, Tamika. And I love how you tied journaling and tuning into the body together. It's really simple and yet so powerful. It gives people a way to slow down and check in with themselves and start, reclaiming their clarity and energy without feeling overwhelmed.
It's a perfect first step. It's definitely the perfect first. And, if you are feeling like, again, if you are feeling like you are feeling so, having some of the signs that we mentioned earlier around fatigue, emotional, physical, spiritual burnout, it is always important to check in with someone, right? Check in with a trusted colleague, friend, explore coaching, explore, seeing a mental health therapist if you're feeling like, you find yourself crying uncontrollably for weeks at a time. That's when you want to make sure you're seeking some help from a professional.
That's a surely hopeful message, Tamika. And this is really an empowering session with you. You showed us that burnout, weak boundaries, and self sabotage aren't the end of the road. They're signals pointing us toward the growth and change. So, listeners, if you have been feeling drained or stuck, take heart. You have the power to pause, to realign, and to lead your life with clarity and courage. So start small, stay consistent, and remember your best leadership begins with how you lead yourself.